On January 7th, 2026, Renee Nicole Good was murdered at the hands of ICE agent Jonathan Ross in Minnesota. Now, legally, I have to tell you that I'm not a lawyer, a judge, or a law enforcement officer and cannot legally say this is murder for certain, but I do have eyes, and we've all seen the same video. Now, I'm sure you've heard about this, and if you haven't, I suggest you watch something or read something from someone who is calmer, for one, and more legally and politically inclined than I am. What you may not have seen is this video of a Fox host degrading Renee in many different ways. He uses 6th grade caliber insults, which surprised me, as that's above the reading level for most of his viewers. I will not show the full clip, and I will not do him the dignity of showing his face, as I'm sure he'd love nothing more.
The woman who lost her life was a self-proclaimed poet from Colorado, with pronouns in her bio.
If this clip enrages you like it enraged me, good, you're on the right side of history. Please keep in mind that Fox cannot legally be considered news, and nobody on it can be legally considered a journalist. Of course, he attacks the pronouns in her bio. That's been the Fox MO for years. Having pronouns in your bio is a completely harmless measure that simply makes it easier for people to address you. They attack this because it's a symbol of open-mindedness and accessibility, things that they hate and are afraid of, because when you're open-minded, you realize that you probably shouldn't be hating everyone for no reason, and that's what Fox's entire business model runs on. One of the many things that jumped out at me from this clip is that this host uses Renee's poetry and stance as a poet to attack her. In a complicated political machine like this, we have to understand that everything is on purpose and deliberate, and nothing is done without reason, which begs the question, why bring up her poetry and her stance as a poet? Well, there are a few reasons, and first and foremost, I would like to thank one of my dear friends who is an incredible poet herself. I would not have been able to as solidly form these points without her insight, so thank you. First and foremost, poetry is not typically a job that generates profit. In our government system, which is essentially an oligarchy and has been for years, we are very profit-driven. People in and around our government and in our society value profit and making money over almost everything else. Calling Renee a poet as an insult insinuates that she was lacking a real job, which is very ironic for a fake journalist. They wanted you to believe that Renee, who was a wife and mother, didn't contribute as much to society and to the economy that you are already being screwed by. And they did this to make her murder seem less awful. Profit should not be the only driving force for all of the things that we do. Fulfillment should be. Poetry can be an incredibly fulfilling thing, and I'll talk more about that here in a moment. A second reason that the Fox host defamed poetry is because it is often seen as a feminine art and practice. Men, especially in a hyper-militant country like America, have often been told to swallow their emotions and not express them, and poetry is famously a very emotive and expressive form of art. In a patriarchy as solidly formed as America's, of course poetry is going to be de-emphasized and discouraged because it goes against masculine values. Also, poetry used to be a male-dominated field, and as soon as it stopped being one, it fell out of fashion. Weird coincidence, right? Fox also attacks Renee for being a lesbian, which the right views as disgusting because of the portrayals that they choose to consume. Poetry has a very long history in lesbian culture, even down to the name. The legendary poet Sappho was known for her romantic poetry geared towards women. She lived in the Greek city of Lesbos, so the term sapphic and the term lesbian both come from her and her poetry. A big part of the reason they're going after Renee for these very trivial things is because she was white. Seeing a white woman killed by law enforcement in America would cause outrage if the circumstances were any different. Fox had to go into overtime to dehumanize her so that people would feel less bad about her murder. My final point on this topic is that you must remember that political machines attack things that they are afraid of people using against them. This informs us of one slightly hopeful thing. The powers that be are afraid of poetry. Despite everything else feeling so horrible and so bleak, this is good news. Now, sure, it's possible that these propagandists are just stupid and don't see the power in poetry, but unfortunately that's not true. These people are not stupid. They just know how to prey on people who are. They wouldn't have said a word about it if they thought it was just stupid. This is fear, and this is weakness. Let me tell you why. In her notes to the Pulitzer Museum, Roni Horn remarks that her art is literally the idea of a finite thing having an infinite range of appearance or expression. Transpose this assertion into the arena of language, and one has recursive possibilities. With a finite number of words, one can create infinite variety. This is a quote from Arthur C. in a 2008 essay collected by the Poetry Foundation. It seems instinctual almost, like something we all know deep down. When we as humans have the ability to communicate at the levels with which we do, we have essentially infinite expressive power. General literacy creates pathways between people that are not otherwise possible, opening up grand possibilities for people to connect with each other, strengthen themselves, and strengthen the bonds that create their community. What Arthur C. is saying here is that through intentional and sincere communication, people can do anything. You may be wondering, though, what jurisdiction he has to be making a claim like this. Arthur C. is the Poet Laureate of the United States, a position I didn't even know existed until the last year or so. The identity of the current Librarian of Congress is actually disputed right now, which is strange. They're appointed directly by the president, which seems to suggest that the president was disregarding his responsibilities and acting flippantly towards a government role. But that would be strange, wouldn't it? Regardless of the way the role is treated now, the role's very existence tells us that someone in the government a long time ago thought poetry was important enough to make it an official government role. The poet gets paid $60,000 a year and exists to spread the power of poetry to the public. My dear friend made a very good point. $60,000 is not a lot of money for the responsibility of spreading art to the public. You could argue that they aren't doing a very good job of spreading poetry to the public, and I would have to agree. This is, of course, on purpose, though. The role is symbolic, traditional, and the reason that nobody knows about it is because it isn't advertised at all. They don't get nearly enough support or thanks for the job they do. The government of our modern day in the past, I don't know how many decades, does not want you to know the power that poetry holds, the power that every person holds, because, as Arthur C. says, you have infinite expressive power. Those in power do not want us to connect with each other, to be civil with each other, or to listen to each other in any way. This is why they divide us so heavily, propagandizing us and radicalizing us to extreme ends of every spectrum, making us believe that our enemies are subhuman. They don't want us to be civil, because if we are, we're harder to control. This division was just one part of a very long plan. Suppression of art and of poetry was one of the first steps in this very long plan because they represent a people's will. If you know history, you know that it's repeating itself, because some of the first figures that Hitler ever went for when he gained power were artists, not only out of jealousy for his own failed career, but because he knows and understands the power that art holds. He classified kinds of arts that he didn't like and or felt threatened by into degenerate art, classifying artists like Matisse, Picasso, and Van Gogh, and so many of the other greats into this category. I bring this up so you know that they were doing this on a massive scale, not just attacking Jewish German artists, but many of the international artists that Germans were familiar with. The Nazis cited Jewish perversion of standards and taste in the work that they classified as degenerate art, and we see this today with a lot of queer representation being classified as the new modern degenerate art. The Nazis, specifically painter and politician Adolf Ziegler, forbid these degenerate artists from making more work, sending them letters directly with legal threats. Then pieces of this degenerate art were removed from museums all across the country and put into a Nazi-curated exhibit so that viewers could visit and mock them. There is a lot more to talk about regarding this movement, but I'm on enough of a tangent already, so I'm going to put some good links to good videos in the description. You can research and find out more about it there. Essentially, what this boiled down to was the fact that the Nazis had a very strict code for art and for morals. Everything that didn't fit their code was degenerative. Authoritarianism in any form operates on strictness, and a big telltale sign of this strictness and of this authoritarianism is a mass criticism of expression. Art, being pure expression, is therefore hated by the machines that do not want you to realize that you can express yourself. Art is our way to deeply express ourselves and have people connect with us, and poetry specifically takes a hit because it is the act of carefulness and intent through direct speech. Generally, when writing poetry, you keep in mind syntax, you keep in mind form, and you have to squeeze as much of a message into as small of an area as possible. This maximizes the message that you're trying to send. Some of the most profoundly human pieces of art ever created exist in less than half of a page. If we were all able to speak in such concise, meaningful ways, we'd all be much more connected, we'd all understand each other much more, and we'd all have much more individual power. Now, I also said that this hatred of poetry is a weakness, not just fear. I believe that people's greatest strengths come from their connection to others. I believe that community is the single most important thing in the world, and the thing that unlocks community is empathy. I think the single weakest thing a person can be is unempathetic. If you cannot connect to other people in an emotional way, you're lacking strength. You're lacking the strings that bind people together, and people who work together create things that are bigger than themselves. Studies show that people who lack empathy are the ones who are unable to connect with more abstract art on an emotional level. So we've got two options then. Either they do understand the power that poetry has and they're afraid of it, or they don't understand the power that poetry has and it's because they lack empathy and are therefore weak. Honestly though, I think it's probably a little bit of both. People are afraid of things they don't understand all the time. All I'm saying is that the two reasons that they don't like poetry are both bad. Please don't get me wrong and assume that I'm saying that if we all just sat around and did poetry all the time, all of our problems in our government and in our country would go away. No, that is obviously not true. All I'm saying is that our path to unity and to enlightenment is very accessible and very raw. All it takes is communication, and poetry is a great exercise in communication. You can stand up to people who prefer it when you kneel, and all you need to do is speak. By being yourself, unabashed and unafraid, you are doing your part in aiding against the oppressor's plan to surgically remove the willpower of all the people they believe to be beneath them. You are voicing your concerns in ways that break through the mundanity and may inspire the people around you. I recommend poetry specifically because it's very accessible. You need no special tools and no special training. All it asks of you are your thoughts and your feelings, and you already have those things inside of you. You, wonderful, powerful you, are already enough to make great art and express yourself and cement yourself as a person of great meaning and great depth and great thought. It isn't often that you're encouraged to sit down and really think about every little thing that you're doing. Every word you say, every letter, and every sound in those words. But poetry encourages exactly that. If nothing else, poetry is a great exercise in the intentional, and the intentional is powerful. There seems to be a war on sincerity now. It's cool to be flippant and nonchalant about everything, even things you should care about. This is an injected trend, an industry plant of the public popular mind, if you will. This lack of care gives oppressors greater power over us, because if we are just sitting stones and they're rushing rivers, well, what are we supposed to do? I can't care about that. Understand that caring about ourselves and about the people around us, is our greatest weapon. We would be impossible to topple, and we could topple anything we wanted. Through poetry, you force yourself to care in high amounts, and by reading other people's poetry, you start to find it very easy to care about them because they've shown you who they are on a profound level. Now that I've explained the kind of general idea, I'd like to get into some specifics. I've talked a lot about the government and the powers that be, but I really think that true enlightenment comes first from examining our day-to-day lives, who we are and what we feel. This is the key to ever becoming adequately powerful again. As I said in my last video, strong individuals make up a strong community, and a strong community can do anything. With that being said, I'm going to talk about one of the first poems that ever got me into poetry, Invictus. This poem has deep cultural ties, showing up everywhere from Winston Churchill to Eugene Debs, from Nelson Mandela to Timothy Chalamet during the Dune 2 press tours. It has since become a beacon, a fount of hope for many people across the globe since its writing, and I really just don't know many other mediums that can do that. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. William Ernest Henley wrote this in 1875 while recovering from surgery on his foot. As a teenager, he lost his leg below the knee from complications due to tuberculosis, and he got surgery to save his other leg from that same fate. It's simple to say things like, I won't give up, or I won't back down, and sure, there is power in those words. They're still good to say and to think, but to create more moving language like this, more emotive, more evocative, you create this fuel, this fire. Not only was this poem empowering for Henley at the time, but it has become empowering for countless others throughout the years. Hey, I am editing right now and wanted to talk about a specific example I read about that shows one of Invictus's many applications. This story comes from Navy Admiral James Stockdale, who was a prisoner of war in Vietnam. Returning to his cell after a session of torture, a fellow prisoner named David Hatcher handed him a piece of scrap paper with the last 4 lines of Invictus written on it using rat droppings. This art form is so meaningful that people in such terrible circumstances can find courage through them, reproducing them by any means necessary as a way to push for perseverance. Now, Invictus has kind of a sketchy history with application as well, and though I don't think it detracts from the poem in any way, I would feel like kind of a liar by omission if I didn't tell you about this. Invictus in full has been cited as the final words of the Oklahoma City bomber, Timothy McVeigh. It was also included in the manifesto of Brenton Tarrant, who perpetrated the New Zealand Christchurch mosque shootings in 2019. These applications should not be used as a way to cite fault with the poem or in poetry in general, as very obviously the poem makes no suggestion to do these sorts of things. McVeigh and Tarrant were both narcissists and sociopaths and should obviously be blamed for their actions much more than any piece of art, especially this poem, could. Any piece of art can be bastardized by someone with poor intentions. It just so happened to be this poem twice. I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul is kind of one of my personal mantras. It's something I repeat to myself all the time, though when I'm in a really dark spot, more accurately, the thing that I repeat to myself is the Green Lantern Oath. Either that or I imagine the scene from the 1986 animated Transformers movie, which I have a poster of from right here, where Optimus Prime says Megatron must be stopped no matter the cost, and then transforms, and then Stan Bush's The Touch starts playing. That is the unique ability of poetry. You can picture a painting and remember how it makes you feel, or you can think of a scene from a movie like I do with the Transformers scene, and with the context invoke the emotions that it brings out. With poetry, this evocation is more direct and more raw. You can have a flat-out conversation from yourself to an artist and back to yourself. Music has a very similar power, but I think that poetry's singleness and focus makes it much more effective in moments of solitude or just deep mentality. Sometimes I don't need fancy instruments or visuals, I just need straight talk, and that's exactly what poetry is. Though it uses beautiful, sometimes wild imagery and metaphor, it's always very close to the heart, very down to earth. Invictus makes me feel strong, brave even. I think of Henley in his darkest moments, triumphing not only over just his injury, but over the fear and the dread that his injury brought. Invictus is a roar, a screaming, crying, I beat you. But it's so much more than that too. Sometimes simple language is enough to communicate a feeling. Sometimes it isn't. The way I see it, the mind is like a small pond, full of hungry fish, thoughts, waiting to be caught and given form. When the pond gets full and I get overwhelmed, and then I try to express myself in simple language, it feels like throwing a handful of feed directly into the middle of the pond. The fish splash and slap, getting over each other, desperately gaming for single pellets, as many as they can get. Sophisticating my language, or even just focusing on it heavily through the use of poetry or any other art, meditative means, feels like crafting the perfect bait for one fish that I know is out there, the biggest fish in there, aiming for just that one fish and pulling it out. Not only do I now have a big fish in my hands, but all the other fish have more room to swim, and the pond feels less overwhelming and chaotic. That thought that you put time and effort towards becomes an even better thought, a more fleshed out one, and all of the other thoughts that you're battling against are more in order. You have a hold on the situation now. Of course, poetry is not the only medium you can use to focus thoughts. There are many different meditations that achieve this same goal. Poetry is one of the only ones that makes you spend time with every word, every sound, breathing it in and out, chewing on it, mixing every letter around, creating rhythm and synchronicity with every other thought that you put on paper. Not only does your final thought become more solid, but the building blocks of that thought become more solid too. You know how things taste better when you know how hard they are to cook? That goes for all art forms. I think when you really know the background and the depths of things, it becomes so much more impressive. But with poetry, you talk all the time. It's what you spend 80% of your life doing to communicate with other people, to connect with other people. And so when poetry elevates this talking to its highest form, you have to know it's something so much more. Meditate is a word that I like to use to talk about deep focus, but meditation also has a connotation with calmness and with solitude. It'd be a lie if I said that each poem was calm. I mean, Invictus was hopeful, but it certainly wasn't calm. When people usually think of poetry, they think of two paths diverging in a yellow wood, or other exhibitions of nature and of love. Some incredible poetry has come from this, there's no debating that, but the poetry that I tend to enjoy more comes from the work of grieving. Grief is not something that happens. It is something that is processed. It is looked at from all angles, felt inside and out, and it changes the people who touch it, much like good poetry does. So much art is done with the intent to help an artist work through their grief, but poetry makes you really work out exactly what you're feeling by picking the best possible word for it. If you're writing a poem about your lost loved one who you cared about very much, you're not going to use a word or a term that you're just fine with or okay with. You only have maybe 50 words to work with, and each of them have to be perfect so that you can clearly and accurately state your message and your feelings. This is what I mean when I say poetry is the best filter for feelings. It forces you to be precise. You can't just be okay with your word choice because each word implies so much more than it might in other mediums. I want to look now at my favorite poem ever, A Ghost That Haunts Just 8 lines. A slumber did my spirit seal. I had no human fears. She seemed a thing that could not feel the touch of earthly years. No motion has she now, no force. She neither hears nor sees, rolled round in earth's diurnal course, with rocks and stones and trees. This is William Wordsworth's A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal, a defaultly titled poem from his 5-poem collection, The Lucy Poems, about an unidentified woman. There is no clear historical consensus about who Lucy may have been. Some say it was a lover, some say it was a daughter, some even say that it was an amalgamation of all of the important women in his life, but there's really no saying for sure. However, one thing that we do know for sure is that clearly in this poem, at least this version of Lucy, is gone. Her absence leaves this deep, horrible, coal-like lament in the pit of your stomach. This is one of the few poems I have fully memorized, not just because of its short length, making it easy, but because it feels like a bullet fragment that doctors just can't remove. It just hits and hurts so deep. Quickly and smoothly communicated, we see a man being torn apart by his grief, but by the virtue of us reading it, we understand that he was able to get over this grief, or at least process it through his writing. In the first stanza, we see that he's been able to process at least part of his emotion, spinning it into this fantastic image. To get the scheme, the rhyme, he clearly had to sit with this feeling and filter it, grabbing the most important parts of his feelings and finding ways to adequately communicate them. The second stanza shows us that he was still battling with these feelings, finding better ways to communicate them, and he kind of spirals out a little bit. It's very simple and easy to grasp, which was Wordsworth's whole MO. He used the language of the common man because he believed that poetry should be accessible to everyone, not just the rich or the sophisticated. We actually see a slight subversion of this method in this poem based on the word diurnal, which was not a common word even at the time. It's a word that means daily or repeated, and it's used here not just to keep the rhythm going, but to illustrate how life moves on whether you want it to or not. He used it regardless of its rarity, which was against what he usually did, because it was simply the best word for that feeling. Wordsworth knows that he has to process his death, even though he can't reverse it or change it, and he has to keep moving because that's what the world does. Art does not stop the world, and it doesn't stop your thoughts. Rather, it gives you a way to look at your progress in how you're dealing with things. Sometimes when I'm feeling down, I just keep getting the same terms in my head over and over. Oh God, I'm so sad, I can't do this. And that's really what keeps me feeling stuck, the fact that I can't think of anything more to say. By not just shutting down in my sadness, but instead transcribing it, I feel much more in control of it. Sad poetry may be a cliche, but it is a great outlet. Most of the poetry I'm going to read today is pretty beginner friendly. It's a lot of very old stuff. I know contemporary is kind of difficult for people, but my goal is to inspire you to explore using these poems for reference. Wordsworth was a great start for me, as this massive book taught me a lot of what I know about poetry, and it's about 60% Wordsworth. So we've briefly talked about the beautiful kind of natural poetry, we talked about melancholy poetry, and we talked about hopeful poetry. I think that these three categories are the ones that kind of pop into people's heads the most whenever they think about poetry, and if not those three, they might think about more erotic or romantic poetry, which you're just going to have to forgive me for not wanting to cover today. But there are large worlds of poetry not covered by these categories, and the one that I love specifically is poetry about anger. Anger isn't thought about much as being a poetic emotion because it's often tied to irrationality and snap decisions, which are the opposite of what poetry is typically made of. But anger in poetry is often represented through subtlety and sophistication. Like I've been saying, poetry takes a lot of filtering and focus, and usually when intensely angry, you either can't focus or focusing settles your anger. Actually, a reason that political agitators like that Fox host from earlier are so purposely irritating is because anger makes it hard to focus, and without focus, we can't make much real progress. Anyway, it makes sense that one would assume that poetry therefore cannot be angry, but that is far from the truth. When the Dakota people were starving, as you may remember, government traders would not extend store credit to Indians. One trader named Andrew Myrick is famous for his refusal to provide credit to Dakota people by saying, "If they are hungry, let them eat grass." There are variations of Myrick's words, but they are all something to that effect. When settlers and traders were killed during the Sioux Uprising, one of the first to be executed by the Dakota was Andrew Myrick. When Myrick's body was found, his mouth was stuffed with grass. I am inclined to call this act by the Dakota warriors a poem. There's irony in their poem. There was no text. That was an excerpt from the poem 38 by Layli Long Soldier from her book Whereas. This book is about how the American government has historically and still treats indigenous people, and it is insane. I really recommend it. She uses a lot of government documents to grab words from and form her own derivative poetry, and it is very strong and very moving. This poem specifically is probably my favorite from the book. I love a lot of the Whereas poems from the last section of the book as well, but I think this is my favorite, kind of more singular poem. I love how tangible the feeling is in this poem, and in some of the parts that I didn't read aloud, it essentially justifies itself as a poem, which I think is really neat, especially for people who aren't super into contemporary poetry. I think this is a great jumping off point. Though its anger may be described as quiet, it is palpable, it is put together, and it is civil. Now, I honestly don't believe that anger should always be filtered. I think that the fiery, burning anger that people sometimes feel should just be let out every so often. But poetry is not often the place for that. Poetic anger is much more akin to a odorless, tasteless poison, whereas other methods of expression are more like a bomb. It gets the same job done, it just does it differently. The reason for this is that poetry used to be the vehicle of seriousness, and historically, if you wanted to be taken seriously, especially as a minority, you have to remain civil, you have to remain calm, and show a certain sense of resolve. It's a sad fact, especially in this poem in which Layli Long Soldier is championing for the equal treatment and acknowledgement of the wrongs that the American government perpetrated onto the indigenous people. She had to remain calm, or else the whole movement would maybe be looked down upon as uncivilized, which is ridiculous. That was another reason that poetry was a great vehicle for social change. It has this sense of wisdom and clarity to it that not a whole lot of other mediums, even direct speech, have. Now, there is a war, a full-on war on intelligence, and of course poetry is being demeaned as not that deep, as well as everything else is. But I think if we as a society work together, we can beat that stigma. Which brings me back to my original point. There are things happening in our world that we seem to be powerless against. I spoke about this a bit earlier and in my last video, but it's a horrible fact that sometimes all we can do is let the people that we love know that we love them. And that is as great of an impact as we can provide. What I want to clarify is that we should never become complacent. What we can do in this situation is strengthen ourselves and therefore our place in a community, and poetry is my preferred method of doing that. Alright, I'm here doing some reshoots. I got into editing and then realized there was some kind of wonky stuff going on with the focus, so ignore the fact that I'm wearing a different shirt. I want to make myself abundantly clear here, even though I know I'm repeating myself. I do not think that poetry and just greater conversation is the one and only key to change and fix the things that we need to change and fix in our government and in our country. I think it's just the first of many steps that need to be taken. It's just that these other steps are above my means. If we all speak our nuanced and most accurate and clear versions of our thoughts, then we get a more diverse conversation, which is more productive. Because when I see things like federal agencies pulling guns on innocent protesters and committing murder in the streets, and then seeing the president and his cartoon henchmen lying about it as if we haven't all seen the same video, I get mad. But so does everybody else, and if we all just say that we're mad, what are we really doing? I've seen the financial exploitation of millions of Americans while the 1%, the rich, keep getting tax cuts, and I'm mad about it, but there's not enough power in that. I see children being separated from their families by the party that claims to be pro-wife, pro-mother, and pro-family, and forced to go to school where they can't eat because this party would rather money go to the rich getting tax cuts instead of kids eating at school. These schools, by the way, that they hate because it educates children and they love the uneducated. This makes me mad. It boils my blood. But we all feel this same bubbling underneath our skin. And what do we do? What do we say? We say we're mad, and that's it. I watch as the party that I'm forced to vote for because it's the lesser of two evils, which is ridiculous, wear color-coordinated outfits in Congress instead of voting or enacting power for meaningful change. And it makes me want to scream. It makes me want to yell off rooftops that I'm angry, I'm upset. But if we all yell, we inconvenience each other with the sound, right? So instead of yelling, I just say, I'm mad. It's tired. It's mundane. It's played out. Our anger is losing its value because everyone is so angry all the time. When anger becomes our daily bread, we starve. We sit at the table, we look and we see that there's no food and we say, I'm mad about this, and we keep saying it until we can't anymore because we're too hungry. Everyone is mad all the time, and when we let it become routine, let it become boring, we become complacent, and we let our enemies, the sources of this anger, win. We are essentially under siege, and we're only mad about it. We've been made pathetic because we've been told to forget about the language that reminds us that we don't have to be. With language, we can truly portray the situation that we're in. If we're only mad, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. When this world's citizens are having their basic rights taken away, and then those rights are being paraded around with idiot glee, it's not enough to be mad. It's not enough to get angry. It's not enough to say that you're upset. We have to rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. That was an excerpt from Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas, and it's originally written about him having to watch his father pass away. This poem speaks of great grief and great tragedy, but it also speaks of hope and latent power. When removed from context, it seems as though it may simply be about the fading of nobility, and when I read it today, I am filled with determination to not let the things that I stand for fade into obscurity. Poetry is, if nothing else, conversation in its most evolved form, and conversation is what keeps us sane. It makes me feel more confident and less alone in my fears and woes. The more specific language gets, the higher capability I have to relate to it and feel listened to. Poetry has power, and it gives this power to all who wield it. Some people are afraid of taking things seriously, and I understand. I was that way for a long time. But if you can get over yourself and start to become more sincere and more poetic, you unlock such great mastery of communication, which, as we talked about, gives you infinite possibility. If you've made it this far, I ask of you one thing. Write a poem. I don't care what it's about, how long it is, if it rhymes or not, whatever. Just think hard about yourself, about your feelings, your thoughts, and your surroundings, and write it down. This video, as you've now grasped, has been about art, expression, and communication as a whole. And really, even deeper, this video is about togetherness through individuality, which it seems like will be the main thesis of my channel. Strengthen yourself and you'll strengthen your community. Speak your mind, but straighten it out first, letting yourself first know what you're really thinking before you let others know. If we do that, we'll all progress in a much more organized and connected way. Again, this is not a solution to these big overlying problems. It just helps us get to a point where we can find those solutions. It gets us out of that pit of complacency and gets us thinking that something really must be done, even if all that something is sending a clear verbal message. My biggest goal for this video is to encourage openness and honesty, both with people and each other and people with themselves. I want to encourage unity and communication. That is all. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, please leave a like and subscribe. This is not a numbers thing for me, but I would really love to know the people that I'm reaching. Not all of my videos will be this explicitly political in nature, but this one tied into current events, and honestly, I was just very, very worked up and needed to get some things out. Please keep in mind that these are just my opinions, and if you respectfully and civilly disagree, I'm all for that. If you have any questions or ideas about the video, please leave a comment. I'm always happy to engage in conversation about things I care about, so that sounds like fun to me. Thank you, and remember, do not go gentle into that good night.